On the night of October 24th, 1942, Private First Class William Hawkins lay in a shallow foxhole on the southern perimeter of Henderson Field, listening to sounds that didn't belong to the jungle. The air hung thick with moisture that made every breath feel like drowning, and the darkness beyond his position was absolute, the kind of black that erased the boundary between earth and sky. In his hands, the M1928A1 Thompson submachine gun felt both like salvation and a death sentence. At 23 years old, Hawkins had been on Guadalcanal for 62 days, long enough to understand that the jungle, after sunset, belonged to the Japanese. Their infiltration tactics had become legendary among the Marines, defending the thin perimeter around the airfield. Enemy soldiers moved through darkness with a skill that seemed almost supernatural, closing to within feet of American positions before striking with bayonets, grenades, and knives that required no aimed fire to be effective. The Thompson he carried should have been the perfect answer to this threat. 9 3/4 pounds of American engineering designed specifically for close-range combat, a shoulder-fired submachine gun capable of delivering controlled bursts of .45 caliber ammunition at 600 rounds per minute. The weapon could be loaded with 20-round box magazines for mobility or 50-round drum magazines for sustained defensive fire, and its closed bolt operation provided first-round accuracy that made it deadly at ranges up to 100 yards. But tonight, like every night for the past month, Hawkins faced a problem that no amount of engineering could solve. In the absolute darkness of the Guadalcanal jungle, the Thompson's distinctive sound signature made it nearly impossible to distinguish from Japanese automatic weapons, and Marine commanders had started ordering their men to leave the weapons in camp rather than risk friendly fire casualties that would accomplish what the enemy could not. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The tactical crisis that kept Hawkins awake had been developing since the Marines first landed on Guadalcanal in August. Japanese forces, initially caught off guard by the American invasion, had quickly adapted their tactics to exploit the jungle terrain and limited visibility that characterized nighttime operations. Intelligence reports translated by Marine linguists revealed a disturbing pattern in enemy tactical doctrine. Japanese commanders were training their soldiers to believe that darkness neutralized American advantages in firepower, making close-range combat with edged weapons the decisive factor in night engagements. Lieutenant Colonel Merrill Edson, whose 1st Raider Battalion had barely held the ridge that now bore his name against repeated Japanese night assaults in September, understood the enemy's logic with brutal clarity. American forces possessed overwhelming superiority in artillery, air support, naval gunfire, and crew-served weapons during daylight hours. But when visibility collapsed to arm's length and communication became impossible beyond shouting distance, those advantages evaporated, leaving individual Marines to fight battles that often came down to who could strike first in the darkness. The infiltration tactics that Japanese forces employed on Guadalcanal had been refined through years of combat in China and Southeast Asia. Enemy soldiers moved in small groups of 3 to 5 men, advancing silently through jungle terrain toward predetermined objectives. They carried minimal equipment to reduce noise, relying on Type 38 or Type 99 Arisaka rifles, hand grenades, and bayonets for close combat. Their movement techniques exploited natural sounds, wind through vegetation, rainfall, the constant chorus of insects and nocturnal animals, to mask their approach until they were close enough to strike before defenders could react effectively. Captain Lewis Puller, whose 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, reinforced the Henderson Field perimeter in September, had documented the psychological toll these tactics took on his men. Marines who performed their duties with confidence during daylight became jumpy and trigger-happy after dark, firing at sounds and shadows that might be enemy soldiers or might be nothing more than wind moving through kunai grass. The constant tension of knowing that death could be seconds away but invisible created stress casualties that didn't bleed but couldn't fight effectively. The Thompson submachine gun had been introduced to Marine Corps arsenals in the 1920s as a law enforcement and small unit weapon designed for urban combat and close-quarters situations. The M1928A1 variant that equipped Marine units on Guadalcanal represented years of refinement with a simplified action that was more reliable and easier to maintain than earlier models. The weapon fired the .45 caliber automatic Colt pistol cartridge, the same heavy subsonic round used in the M1911 pistol that every Marine officer carried. The .45 caliber cartridge delivered exceptional stopping power at close range, its heavy bullet transferring enormous energy to any target it struck. Unlike the higher velocity rifle cartridges that could pass through a target and continue traveling, the .45 caliber round typically expended its energy within the first few inches of penetration, creating massive tissue damage that stopped enemy soldiers immediately. This characteristic made the Thompson devastatingly effective in the close-range jungle combat that characterized Guadalcanal operations, but the same subsonic velocity that gave the .45 caliber round its stopping power also created the acoustic signature problem that was paralyzing Marine small unit tactics. When fired, the Thompson produced a distinctive chattering sound at 600 rounds per minute, roughly 10 rounds per second, to American ears, trained on rifle fire from bolt-action Springfields and semi-automatic Garand. This rapid-fire cadence sounded similar to Japanese light machine guns and automatic rifles that fired at comparable rates. The Japanese Type 96 and Type 99 light machine guns, both chambered in 6.5mm, produced similar rapid-fire sound signatures when employed in short bursts. The Type 100 submachine gun, though rare in the Solomon Islands during 1942, also created acoustic patterns that untrained ears could easily confuse with American automatic weapons. In daylight, muzzle flash patterns, weapon silhouettes, and uniform identification made friend or foe determination straightforward. In darkness, sound became the only identification system available, and sound was proving fatally unreliable. Staff Sergeant John Bassalone, whose machine gun section would later hold a critical defensive position during the October assault, had witnessed the confusion firsthand during night patrols in September. His Marines had spent 40 minutes maneuvering toward what sounded like a Japanese machine gun position, only to discover it was an American listening post equipped with a Thompson and a Browning automatic rifle. The near miss had shaken both groups, but more importantly, it had revealed how easily the acoustic environment could turn Marines into threats to each other. Major General Alexander Vandergrift, commanding the 1st Marine Division, received reports throughout September and early October that painted a disturbing picture of tactical paralysis. Marine units, equipped with superior close-range firepower, were losing night engagements because commanders were too afraid of friendly fire casualties to authorize employment of automatic weapons. Japanese infiltrators had apparently learned about this American weakness and were exploiting it ruthlessly, firing short bursts from their own weapons to trigger confusion and fratricide among Marine positions before launching attacks during the chaos that followed. The mathematical realities of night combat in the Guadalcanal jungle were brutally simple. Visibility on clear nights with partial moonlight collapsed to 15 feet in open areas and 5 feet or less in dense vegetation. During rainfall, which occurred almost daily, visibility dropped to 0, beyond arm's length. The human eye, which provided Marines with their primary threat detection system during daylight operations, became nearly useless after sunset, forcing soldiers to rely on hearing as their primary sense for identifying threats and coordinating with nearby units. Sound moved through the jungle environment in complex patterns that defied simple analysis. In dense forest, gunfire echoed and distorted, bouncing off tree trunks and thick vegetation in ways that made sources. Location extremely difficult. In bamboo groves, sharp cracks from rifle fire could be heard clearly at greater distances, but the direction of origin became confused by acoustic reflections that seemed to come from multiple locations simultaneously. Along creek beds and in low-lying areas where morning fog settled, the sound of moving water masked footsteps and equipment noise, but amplified sudden sharp sounds like bolt actions being cycled or magazines being changed. Lieutenant William White, leading reconnaissance patrols for 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, had attempted to document these acoustic patterns in his after-action reports, trying to create guidelines that would help Marines distinguish friendly from enemy fire. His efforts revealed the fundamental impossibility of the task. Individual weapons produce different sound signatures based on ammunition load, barrel condition, atmospheric conditions, and distance from the observer. What sounded like a Thompson at 50 yards might be a Japanese Type 100 at 30 yards, or it might be a Browning automatic rifle firing in short bursts at 75 yards. The crisis reached its peak during the night of October 13th through 14th, when Japanese naval forces bombarded Henderson Field with such intensity that Marines later called it the bombardment. Battleships and cruisers fired nearly 1,000 shells of 8-inch or larger caliber directly into the American perimeter, destroying aircraft, ammunition dumps, and fuel stores while inflicting casualties that tested the division's medical capacity. The psychological impact was even more severe than the physical damage, as Marines realized that their defensive positions offered minimal protection against high-caliber naval artillery fired with precision that suggested excellent intelligence about American positions. In the aftermath of the bombardment, with communication systems disrupted and unit cohesion shattered by hours of sustained shell fire, Japanese ground forces launched infiltration attacks against positions they believed had been softened by the naval gunfire. Small groups of enemy soldiers penetrated deep into the American perimeter, exploiting gaps in the defensive line and moving through areas that were supposed to be secured. The resulting close-range firefights occurred at ranges where the Thompson should have been decisive, yet Marine commanders found themselves unable to authorize its employment without creating unacceptable risks of friendly fire casualties. Private First Class Mitchell Page, whose machine gun position would anchor a critical defense 2 weeks later, experienced the night of October 13th as a revelation of American vulnerability. His sector had been penetrated by a Japanese patrol that got within 10 yards of his position before being detected, close enough that he could hear them breathing and smell the fish they had eaten for their last meal. The engagement that followed lasted less than 2 minutes, but left 3 Japanese soldiers dead and 2 Marines wounded, one by enemy fire and one by a ricocheting American bullet that had struck a tree at an angle that sent it back into friendly positions. The weapon that should have been perfect for jungle fighting was being abandoned at exactly the moment when Marines needed it most. Battalion commanders throughout the 1st Marine Division were quietly discouraging Thompson employment during night operations, preferring that their men carry bolt-action Springfield rifles or semi-automatic Garand rifles that produce distinctly American sound signatures when fired. But this left patrol teams and defensive positions vulnerable at precisely the ranges where Japanese infiltration tactics were strongest, creating a tactical dilemma that threatened to hand the enemy an advantage they could not achieve through direct combat. The solution to this crisis would not come from division headquarters or from Marine Corps equipment developers thousands of miles away in the United States. It would emerge from the tactical innovations of small unit leaders who understood that weapons were only effective when Marines had permission to use them, and that permission required systematic solutions to problems that conventional doctrine had never anticipated. Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson stood at the center of that solution, though few Marines on Guadalcanal in October 1942 would have predicted that the controversial officer would provide the answer to their most pressing tactical challenge. At 46 years old, Carlson was an outsider in his own service, a man whose unorthodox ideas and political connections had made him simultaneously admired and distrusted within the Marine Corps hierarchy. But his experience with Chinese communist guerrillas fighting Japanese occupation forces had taught him lessons about small unit tactics in Asian jungle environments that would prove invaluable on Guadalcanal. The 2nd Marine Raider Battalion that Carlson commanded represented a complete departure from standard Marine Corps organization and doctrine, where conventional Marine infantry battalions relied on squad-sized units of 12 to 13 men operating under centralized control from platoon and company commanders. Carlson's Raiders fought in 3-man fire teams that possessed remarkable tactical independence. Each team consisted of a Browning automatic rifleman who provided sustained firepower, a rifleman who delivered precision fire and fed ammunition to his teammates, and a Thompson gunner who existed for one purpose: winning the first 3 seconds of close-range contact. The Chinese guerrillas who had taught Carlson these techniques understood something that conventional military doctrine often overlooked. Jungle warfare was won by the side that could make tactical decisions faster at the lowest organizational level, when visibility was measured in feet and communication was limited to shouting distance. Waiting for orders from distant commanders meant death. Small teams of men who trusted each other completely and understood their individual responsibilities within a coordinated system could fight more effectively than larger units that required constant supervision and coordination from above. Carlson's solution to the Thompson identification crisis wasn't to ban the weapon or restrict its use to daylight operations. His approach was more fundamental: redesign how Marines employed it, creating systematic procedures that would let them use their most effective close-range weapons safely while maintaining the aggressive tactics necessary to defeat Japanese infiltration attempts. The problem had never been the Thompson itself. The problem was using it without proper organization, clear communication protocols, and disciplined fire control measures that addressed the realities of night combat in jungle terrain. As October gave way to November and Japanese forces prepared for major offensives designed to recapture Henderson Field and drive American forces from Guadalcanal, the tactical innovations that Carlson's Raiders were developing would be tested under the most demanding conditions the Pacific War had yet produced. The jungle that had seemed to favor Japanese infiltration tactics was about to prove that it could be mastered by Americans who understood its challenges and adapted their methods accordingly. The Thompson submachine gun, feared by commanders and avoided by soldiers who had watched it nearly cause friendly fire disasters, was about to become the foundation of American small unit superiority in night combat. But first, Marines would have to learn that superior weapons required superior tactics, and that tactical superiority came from systematic preparation rather than individual improvisation. The 3-man fire team concept that Carlson brought to Guadalcanal had been forged in the mountains of northern China, where 8th Route Army guerrillas had survived 3 years of fighting Japanese occupation forces in terrain that bore striking similarities to the Solomon Islands jungle. Chinese communist commanders had learned through brutal experience that large formations were vulnerable to Japanese firepower advantages, while small teams of soldiers who understood their individual roles could achieve tactical objectives that conventional units could not accomplish. Carlson had observed these tactics firsthand during his time as a military observer with Chinese forces from 1937 through 1939. He had watched 3-man teams infiltrate Japanese positions, conduct ambushes, and disappear into terrain that seemed incapable of concealing a single person. The Chinese didn't rely on superior equipment or overwhelming firepower. They relied on organization, discipline, and absolute trust among team members who knew that survival depended on flawless execution of coordinated tactics. When Carlson returned to the United States and began organizing the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion in early 1942, he carried these lessons with him. The battalion's official designation emphasized its role in conducting raids and special operations behind enemy lines, but Carlson's vision extended beyond commando missions to fundamental reform of how Marines fought in close-quarters combat. His 3-man fire teams represented not just a different organizational structure, but a completely different philosophy about how small units should function under conditions where centralized control became impossible. The Thompson gunner in each Raider fire team occupied the central tactical position, though conventional doctrine would have placed him in a support role. Carlson understood that in jungle combat, where most engagements occurred at ranges under 50 yards, the ability to deliver immediate, overwhelming firepower at close range often determined who survived the first seconds of contact. The Thompson's capacity for controlled automatic fire made it the perfect weapon for this role, but only if the gunner could employ it without fear of being killed by his own men. The first component of Carlson's solution was sectors of fire, a deceptively simple concept that required significant training to implement effectively. Before beginning any patrol or establishing any defensive position, each three-man team established specific areas of responsibility with clear boundaries that prevented overlapping fields of fire. The Thompson gunner operated within a 30-degree arc directly to his team's front, the primary sector where enemy contact was most likely to occur. The Browning automatic rifleman covered the left flank with a 45-degree sector that extended from the team's left boundary to a point slightly forward of their position. The rifleman, with his Springfield or Garand, covered the right flank with a corresponding sector. These sectors weren't merely suggestions or general guidelines. They represented absolute boundaries that each Marine understood and adhered to regardless of tactical circumstances. When enemy fire erupted from outside his designated sector, a Marine held his fire unless his teammates were unable to engage the threat. When movement occurred within his sector, he bore sole responsibility for identifying and engaging targets without waiting for permission from team leaders. This system eliminated the confusion that had caused friendly fire incidents in conventional units, where multiple Marines might engage the same target from different positions or fire towards sounds without understanding where their teammates were positioned. Challenge and password procedures formed the second layer of Carlson's fire discipline system, addressing the acoustic identification problem that had made commanders afraid to authorize Thompson employment. The system was ancient, dating back to military operations before recorded history, but Carlson adapted it specifically for the Guadalcanal environment, where visibility made visual identification impossible and sound became the primary friend or foe determination method. Each day, patrol leaders distributed passwords at briefing sessions before teams departed the perimeter. The passwords changed daily and consisted of two-word phrases, chosen specifically because they were difficult for Japanese soldiers to pronounce correctly. Words containing L and R sounds proved particularly effective, as these phonemes didn't exist in Japanese, and native speakers struggled to distinguish between them. Lucky Larry, or Rubber Ruler, forced anyone responding to demonstrate linguistic capability that enemy infiltrators couldn't fake convincingly. Before engaging any target that hadn't already initiated fire, raiders were required to issue verbal challenges. The protocol was simple but absolute. If you could hear something moving in the darkness, you challenged it before shooting. The challenge consisted of shouting the first word of the day's password and waiting for the response, friend or foe. Determination took seconds. Fast enough, the Japanese soldiers attempting to exploit the delay rarely succeeded in gaining tactical advantage. The system wasn't perfect. Stressed Marines sometimes forgot the procedures in the chaos of sudden contact. Enemy soldiers occasionally learned American passwords through captured documents or interrogation of prisoners. Acoustic conditions sometimes made verbal communication impossible, forcing Marines to make decisions based on incomplete information. But the framework provided a foundation that reduced friendly fire incidents dramatically while maintaining the aggressive employment of automatic weapons that Japanese infiltration tactics required. Controlled burst fire represented the third element of Carlson's Thompson employment doctrine. Marine Corps training manuals had always emphasized short bursts of 3 to 6 rounds rather than sustained automatic fire, but jungle conditions and stress had caused many Marines to abandon fire discipline in favor of volume. Untrained Thompson gunners would pull the trigger and hold it down until the magazine emptied, spraying 45 caliber rounds in the general direction of threats without delivering effective fire against specific targets. Carlson's training regime drilled raiders on burst control until it became automatic muscle memory that functioned even under extreme stress. Thompson gunners learned to feel the weapon's cyclic rate through their hands and shoulders, understanding that at 600 rounds per minute, a 20-round box magazine would empty in 2 seconds of sustained fire. They practiced 3-round bursts that lasted half a second, delivering precisely the amount of firepower needed to suppress or neutralize individual targets without wasting ammunition or revealing their positions unnecessarily through extended muzzle flash. The training took place during daylight hours on firing ranges established near the Henderson Field perimeter, where raiders could practice without risk of friendly fire incidents. But the real test came during night firing exercises that simulated the darkness and confusion of actual combat. Marines learned to fire their Thompsons at targets they could barely see, relying on sound, muzzle flash, and silhouette recognition to identify enemy positions. They discovered that controlled bursts not only conserved ammunition, but improved accuracy, as the weapon's recoil had less time to climb during short bursts than during sustained fire. Weapon pairing completed Carlson's fireteam concept, ensuring that the Thompson never operated in isolation, but always functioned as part of a coordinated system covering multiple ranges and target types. The Browning automatic rifle provided sustained firepower against targets beyond 50 yards, its 30 caliber ammunition delivering effective fire at ranges where the Thompson's subsonic 45 caliber rounds lost velocity and accuracy. The Springfield or Garand rifle offered precision fire against individual targets at ranges up to 300 yards, far beyond the Thompson's effective envelope. This weapons mix created overlapping fields of fire that covered every range, from hand-to-hand combat distance to the maximum effective range of small arms. Enemy infiltrators couldn't exploit gaps in the defense by attacking from ranges where American weapons were ineffective, because at every range, at least one weapon system in the fireteam was optimized for engagement. The system transformed 3 individual Marines with 3 different weapons into a single tactical unit whose combined capabilities exceeded the sum of its parts. The psychological transformation that these tactics produced was as important as their technical effectiveness. Marines who had been afraid to use their Thompsons because the weapons might get them killed by their own men suddenly found themselves equipped with procedures that made safe employment possible. The confidence boost rippled through Carlson's battalion as raiders realized they could fight aggressively without fear of fratricide, making them more willing to close with enemy forces and more effective in the close-range engagements that determined survival in jungle combat. Sergeant Anthony Palladino, a 24-year-old Marine from Pennsylvania who served as a fireteam leader in Carlson's battalion, became one of the first raiders to prove the effectiveness of the new tactics under actual combat conditions. On November 4th, his team encountered a Japanese patrol near the Metapona River during a reconnaissance mission designed to identify enemy troop concentrations west of the American perimeter. The contact began at 25 yards in dense jungle where visibility was limited to arm's length, even in full daylight. Palladino issued the prescribed challenge, shouting "Lucky" into the darkness, while his teammates took covered positions that gave them clear sectors of fire. The response came in broken English that approximated the correct password, but with pronunciation that revealed the speaker's Japanese origin. The L sound in Larry came out closer to Raleigh, distinct enough that Palladino recognized it as an enemy immediately. Thompson came to his shoulder in a smooth motion that reflected hundreds of repetitions during training. The first burst, 3 rounds in half a second, targeted the location where the voice had originated. The muzzle flash illuminated vegetation and a figure diving for cover, confirming enemy presence. Palladino shifted his aim point slightly left and fired a second 3-round burst, this time rewarded with a cry that indicated a hit. His teammates engaged simultaneously from their designated sectors. The Browning automatic rifleman to his left fired a 6-round burst toward movement detected in his area of responsibility. The rifleman to his right delivered single-aimed shots from his Garand at muzzle flashes barely visible through the vegetation. The coordinated fire lasted less than 2 minutes before the surviving Japanese soldiers withdrew, leaving 4 of their number dead in the jungle. The engagement that would have paralyzed a conventional Marine squad with fear of friendly fire casualties had been executed flawlessly by a 3-man team that understood their responsibilities and trusted each other completely. More importantly, neighboring raider teams operating nearby had heard Palladino's Thompson firing and correctly identified it as friendly because he had issued the proper challenge beforehand, and his fire had remained strictly within his assigned sector. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The success of Carlson's tactics spread through the 1st Marine Division faster than official doctrine ever could. Individual Marines talked to friends in other units, describing how raiders were employing Thompsons effectively without causing friendly fire incidents. Squad leaders and platoon commanders began requesting briefings on raider fire discipline procedures, recognizing that conventional tactics were failing while Carlson's innovations were succeeding. By mid-November, Marine units throughout the Guadalcanal perimeter were implementing modified versions of raider small unit tactics, even when their battalion commanders hadn't officially authorized the changes. The transformation occurred at the grassroots level, driven by Marines who understood that their survival depended on using every weapon available, rather than abandoning effective firepower because of identification challenges. Lieutenant William White, whose reconnaissance platoon had suffered through weeks of friendly fire near misses in September and October, formally adopted challenge and password procedures and sectors of fire for his entire unit in early November. The results were immediate and dramatic. His Marines stopped being afraid to use their Thompsons during night patrols, and their combat effectiveness improved proportionally. Enemy infiltrators, who had previously penetrated American positions with relative ease, now encountered aggressive patrols that employed automatic weapons confidently and effectively. The campaign-level implications became clear to Major General Vandergrift, who recognized that small unit tactical improvements had strategic consequences for the entire Guadalcanal operation. The defensive perimeter around Henderson Field depended absolutely on aggressive patrolling that prevented Japanese forces from massing for major attacks. If Marine patrols couldn't employ their most effective close-range weapons, enemy infiltration would eventually create conditions for a breakthrough that could threaten the airfield itself. Vandergrift authorized the distribution of Carlson's tactical procedures throughout the division in mid-November, formalizing what many units had already begun implementing informally. The directive emphasized that these were guidelines rather than rigid requirements, recognizing that different terrain and tactical situations might require modifications. But the core principles, sectors of fire, challenge and password procedures, controlled burst fire and weapon pairing, became standard elements of Marine small unit doctrine on Guadalcanal. The test of this new doctrine came during the most intensive period of Japanese offensive operations, when enemy forces made their final major attempt to recapture Henderson Field and drive American forces from the island. Between November 20th and December 4th, Japanese commanders launched a series of coordinated attacks that combined naval bombardment, airstrikes, and ground assaults, designed to overwhelm the Marine perimeter through simultaneous pressure from multiple directions. The ground component of these attacks relied heavily on night infiltration tactics that had previously proven effective against American positions. Japanese soldiers moved through the jungle in small groups, seeking gaps in the defensive line where they could penetrate deeply into the rear areas and attack command posts, supply dumps, and artillery positions that were supposedly secure behind the front lines. The success of these tactics depended on Japanese assumptions about American vulnerabilities during night operations, assumptions that were becoming obsolete as Marine units learned to employ their automatic weapons effectively in darkness. Staff Sergeant John Basilone's defensive position on the night of October 24th through 25th became the defining test of whether new tactics could defeat determined enemy attacks under the most demanding conditions. Basilone commanded a machine gun section positioned on a ridge overlooking the Lunga River, a critical avenue of approach that Japanese forces had to cross to reach Henderson Field from their assembly areas to the south. His position included two M1817 Browning water-cooled machine guns, the heavy .30 caliber weapons that provided the backbone of Marine defensive firepower. But his section also included Marines armed with Thompsons, Browning automatic rifles, and Garand rifles, creating a layered defense that could engage targets at every range, from extreme rifle distance down to hand-to-hand combat. The Japanese attack began shortly after midnight with mortar fire that destroyed one of Basilone's machine guns and killed or wounded half his section. Enemy infantry followed immediately, moving up the slopes in waves that exploited the gaps created by the preparatory bombardment. The engagement that followed tested every principle that Carlson had established and that Marine units throughout the division were learning to implement. Basilone's surviving Marines fought as coordinated teams rather than isolated individuals. Thompson gunners engaged enemy soldiers who penetrated to close range, using controlled bursts that conserved ammunition while delivering devastating firepower against targets that appeared suddenly from the darkness. Their fire remained disciplined, operating within assigned sectors that prevented friendly fire incidents even when multiple teams were engaging simultaneously from different positions. The battle lasted through the night, with Japanese forces making repeated attempts to overrun the position through sheer numbers. Basilone personally operated his surviving machine gun, firing until the barrel glowed red and water in the cooling jacket boiled away. When ammunition ran low, he made repeated trips through enemy fire to bring forward ammunition that other positions had abandoned. His leadership held the line at a point where breakthrough would have given Japanese forces access to the heart of the American defensive perimeter. The Thompson submachine guns, that had been considered too dangerous for night operations, proved decisive during the closest range fighting. When enemy soldiers penetrated to within yards of Marine positions, the automatic weapons, employed according to Carlson's fire discipline procedures, allowed Marines to deliver concentrated firepower without creating the friendly fire chaos that Japanese tactics had been designed to exploit. By dawn, Basilone's position had held, and Japanese forces were withdrawing after suffering casualties that made continuation of the attack impossible. The tactical success at Basilone's position was replicated across the entire Marine perimeter during the November fighting. Units that had adopted radar fire discipline procedures were holding their ground and inflicting disproportionate casualties on attacking enemy forces. The Thompson, far from being a liability that had to be banned from night operations, had become the cornerstone of American defensive success in the close-range combat that characterized jungle warfare. The captured diary of a Japanese infantry officer found in a defensive position near Kokumbona in early December revealed how enemy perceptions of American night fighting capability were changing. The entries described increasing frustration with infiltration tactics that had worked effectively in September but were failing by November. American positions that had previously been vulnerable to close approach were now defended by aggressive Marines who employed automatic weapons with a confidence that suggested improved training and leadership. The officer's final entry, written days before his death, concluded with an observation that would have seemed impossible 3 months earlier. The Americans had learned to fight in darkness, and their automatic weapons were becoming as effective at night as they were during daylight operations. The tactical advantage that Japanese forces had counted on to offset American superiority in firepower and material was disappearing. The systematic approach that Carlson had brought to the Thompson employment problem represented more than just tactical innovation. It reflected a fundamental understanding about how military organizations adapt to challenges that conventional doctrine cannot address. The weapon itself had never changed. It remained the same M1928A1 Thompson that Marine Corps arsenals had been issuing since the 1930s, with the same operating mechanism, the same .45 caliber chambering, and the same theoretical capabilities it had always possessed. What had changed was the framework surrounding the weapon's employment, the organizational structure and tactical procedures that transformed individual hardware into an effective combat system. Carlson understood that weapons don't win battles by themselves. Weapons win battles when soldiers can use them confidently under the worst conditions without losing control of their tactical situation or their unit cohesion. The lessons learned on Guadalcanal regarding Thompson employment spread throughout Marine Corps units preparing for subsequent operations in the Pacific Theater. As the 1st Marine Division rotated to Australia in December 1942, for rest and refitting, the tactical procedures that had proven effective on Guadalcanal travelled with veterans who would form the core of rebuilt units. The three-man fire team concept, sectors of fire, challenge and password procedures, and controlled burst fire doctrine became standard training elements for Marine units preparing for operations in the Marshall Islands, the Marianas, and eventually the assault on Japan itself. The 2nd Marine Raider Battalion continued operating on Guadalcanal after the division's departure, conducting the longest patrol in Marine Corps history up to that point. From November 6th through December 4th, Carlson's raiders moved 150 miles through enemy-controlled territory, engaging Japanese forces 17 times and completing their mission with acceptable casualties while inflicting significant losses on enemy units they encountered. Every engagement involved Thompson submachine guns, employed according to the fire discipline procedures that Carlson had developed, and none resulted in friendly fire casualties despite the demanding conditions under which the raiders operated. The patrol demonstrated conclusively that systematic tactical procedures could enable safe employment of automatic weapons under circumstances where conventional doctrine would have required restricting their use. Private First Class William Hawkins, whose foxhole vigil had opened this narrative, survived the Guadalcanal campaign and returned to combat during the Tarawa assault in November 1943. He carried a Thompson submachine gun ashore on Betio Island, using it with the confidence that came from knowing his weapon could be employed safely when the tactical situation demanded automatic fire at close range. His Medal of Honor citation would document actions during that assault that exemplified the aggressive small unit tactics Guadalcanal veterans brought to subsequent operations. Hawkins died on the 3rd day of the Tarawa battle while single-handedly assaulting Japanese defensive positions that conventional tactics could not reduce without prohibitive casualties. His employment of the Thompson during these final actions reflected everything the weapon could accomplish when Marines understood both its capabilities and its proper tactical application. The firepower that had seemed too dangerous to use in September 1942 had become, by November 1943, the foundation of American infantry superiority in close-range Pacific combat. The strategic implications of solving the Thompson identification crisis extended far beyond the tactical level where individual engagements were won or lost. Guadalcanal represented the first major American offensive operation in the Pacific Theater, and its success or failure would determine the pace of subsequent operations against Japanese-held territory. The campaign's outcome depended on maintaining control of Henderson Field, which in turn depended on preventing Japanese forces from massing for attacks that could overwhelm the defensive perimeter. Aggressive patrolling provided the key to preventing enemy force concentration, but effective patrolling required that small Marine units could operate confidently at night when Japanese infiltration tactics were most effective. The tactical innovations that made Thompson employment safe during night operations directly enabled the aggressive patrolling that kept Japanese forces off balance throughout the critical period from October through December 1942. Without these innovations, Marine commanders would have faced an impossible choice between accepting friendly fire casualties from Thompson employment or abandoning automatic weapons during night operations and accepting higher casualties from enemy infiltrators. Either option would have reduced patrol effectiveness and potentially allowed Japanese forces to achieve the concentration necessary for successful major attacks. The solution that emerged from Carlson's tactical experimentation broke this dilemma, allowing Marine units to maintain both aggressive patrolling and safe weapons employment. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, whose defense of the ridge that bore his name had demonstrated the cost of fighting without effective small unit tactics, incorporated radar-fire discipline procedures into his battalion's training when the 1st Marine Division rebuilt in Australia. His after-action reports emphasized that weapons technology meant nothing without tactical procedures that enabled their safe employment under combat conditions. The M1928A1 Thompson was an excellent weapon, Edson concluded, but only when used by Marines who understood that fire discipline and unit coordination were more important than raw firepower. The Japanese military's assessment of American combat effectiveness evolved significantly between the Guadalcanal campaign and subsequent Pacific operations. Intelligence reports captured during the Marshall Islands campaign in 1944 revealed that Japanese tactical doctrine had been revised to account for improved American night fighting capabilities. Enemy commanders were no longer assuming that darkness would neutralize American firepower advantages, and infiltration tactics were being modified to reduce exposure to the automatic weapons that American small units now employed confidently during night operations. This shift in enemy tactical thinking represented a strategic victory that extended beyond Guadalcanal to influence the entire Pacific War. Japanese forces had built their defensive strategy around the assumption that jungle terrain and night operations would offset American material superiority, forcing combat into conditions where Japanese training and fighting spirit would prove decisive. The systematic destruction of this assumption through improved American small unit tactics forced Japanese commanders to seek other ways to offset the overwhelming advantages American forces enjoyed in firepower, logistics, and industrial capacity. The Thompson submachine gun that had been at the center of this tactical evolution continued serving with Marine Corps units throughout the Pacific War, though its role gradually changed as combat moved from jungle terrain to the coral atolls and volcanic islands that characterized later campaigns. The weapon remained effective in close-range combat, but the open terrain of islands like Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima often created engagement ranges where rifles and crew-served machine guns proved more valuable than submachine guns optimized for jungle fighting. By 1945, the M1 carbine had largely replaced the Thompson as the standard weapon for Marines in roles requiring compact automatic capability. The carbine was lighter, easier to carry, and fired a .30 caliber cartridge that offered better range than the Thompson's .45 caliber round. But the tactical procedures developed around Thompson employment, sectors of fire, challenge and password protocols, controlled burst fire, and weapon pairing, remained relevant regardless of which specific weapons Marines carried. Staff Sergeant John Basilone received the Medal of Honor for his actions on Guadalcanal, becoming one of the most celebrated Marines of the Pacific War. He returned to the United States for a war bond tour, but requested return to combat duty, unwilling to remain on the home front while his fellow Marines continued fighting. He died on Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, during the first day of that campaign's assault, killed while leading his machine gun section against Japanese defensive positions. The tactical legacy he helped establish on Guadalcanal continued influencing Marine Corps small unit doctrine long after his death. The fire discipline procedures and weapons employment techniques that had enabled Marines to fight effectively in darkness became institutional knowledge, passed from veterans to new Marines through training programs that emphasized the lessons learned in the Solomon Islands. The psychological transformation that occurred on Guadalcanal proved as important as the tactical innovations it produced. Marines learned that weapons were tools whose effectiveness depended on the skill and discipline of the men employing them rather than inherent characteristics of the hardware itself. The Thompson hadn't become more reliable or more powerful between September and December 1942. What had changed was Marine understanding of how to employ it safely and effectively under conditions that initially seemed to make its use impossible. This lesson transcended specific weapons or tactical situations to influence how the Marine Corps approached problem-solving throughout the remainder of the war and into the post-war period. When confronted with tactical challenges that conventional doctrine couldn't address, Marine commanders increasingly looked toward innovative employment of existing capabilities rather than waiting for new equipment or modified organizational structures. The cultural shift from rigid adherence to doctrine toward adaptive problem-solving became one of Guadalcanal's most enduring legacies. Captain Louis Puller, whose battalion had arrived on Guadalcanal in September and fought through the most intensive period of Japanese offensive operations, carried the tactical lessons learned during those desperate months into his subsequent commands. He became the most decorated Marine in the Corps' history, receiving 5 Navy Crosses for actions that consistently demonstrated the effectiveness of well-trained small units employing their weapons aggressively within a framework of systematic fire discipline. His leadership style emphasized initiative at the lowest organizational levels, trusting individual Marines and junior leaders to make tactical decisions based on training and experience, rather than waiting for orders from above. This approach reflected everything Carlson had demonstrated about the relationship between small unit autonomy and combat effectiveness in jungle warfare. The final phase of the Guadalcanal campaign, from December 1942 through February 1943, saw Japanese forces conducting a fighting withdrawal toward evacuation points on the island's western coast. Marine units pursuing these retreating forces encountered rearguard actions where enemy soldiers used the same infiltration tactics that had proven effective earlier in the campaign. But the tactical balance had shifted decisively in favor of American forces, who now employed their automatic weapons confidently during night operations. The Thompson submachine gun the Japanese commanders had expected would be neutralized by darkness, and acoustic confusion had instead become a symbol of American adaptation and tactical innovation. Enemy soldiers who had been trained to believe that American firepower meant nothing after sunset were discovering that well-organized Marine units could deliver devastating automatic fire at close range, regardless of visibility conditions. By the time organized Japanese resistance on Guadalcanal ended in early February 1943, the strategic lessons of the campaign were already influencing planning for subsequent operations. American commanders understood that jungle warfare required specialized training and tactical procedures that differed significantly from conventional doctrine developed for European combat. The small unit tactics that had emerged from necessity on Guadalcanal became the foundation for training programs that prepared Marine and Army units for fighting throughout the Pacific theater. The cost of these lessons had been severe. The 1st Marine Division suffered over 7,000 casualties during the 6-month Guadalcanal campaign, with disease claiming nearly as many Marines as enemy action. But the tactical innovations developed during those desperate months proved invaluable during subsequent operations, where American forces faced similar challenges in jungle terrain against an enemy that employed comparable infiltration tactics. The weapon that had nearly been abandoned because it seemed too dangerous to use in darkness had proven, through systematic tactical innovation, to be exactly what Marines needed for the close-range combat that characterized Pacific jungle warfare. The M1928A1 Thompson submachine gun hadn't changed, but Marine Corps understanding of how to employ it safely and effectively had been revolutionized by officers and NCOs who refused to accept that superior weapons required abandonment because of identification challenges. Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson's contribution to this transformation extended beyond the specific tactical procedures he developed. His willingness to challenge conventional doctrine and implement innovations based on experience fighting similar enemies in similar terrain demonstrated that military organizations could adapt rapidly when leaders possessed both the vision to see what needed to change and the courage to implement changes that contradicted established practice. Carlson's career would end controversially after the war, his political views and unorthodox methods making him a figure of continued debate within the Marine Corps, but his tactical legacy remained unassailable. The fire team concept, the emphasis on small unit initiative, and the systematic approach to weapons employment under demanding conditions became permanent elements of Marine Corps doctrine that influenced training and operations for decades after Guadalcanal. The jungle that had seemed to favor Japanese infiltration tactics in August 1942 had been mastered by December through American adaptation, training, and systematic tactical innovation. The darkness that was supposed to neutralize American firepower advantages had instead become an environment where well-trained Marines could employ their weapons with confidence that came from understanding both the capabilities and limitations of their equipment. The Thompson submachine gun, dismissed by some as unsuitable for jungle conditions and feared by others as too dangerous for night operations, had become the foundation of American small unit superiority in the close-range combat that determined tactical success throughout the Pacific War. The weapon itself remained essentially unchanged from the design John Moses Browning had created decades earlier. What had changed was the Marine Corps' understanding that superior weapons required superior tactics, and that tactical superiority came from systematic preparation rather than individual improvisation or raw courage. As the 1st Marine Division departed Guadalcanal for rest and refitting in Australia, they carried with them hard-won knowledge about jungle warfare that would shape American military doctrine for the remainder of the Pacific campaign and beyond. The tactical procedures developed around Thompson employment represented only one element of this knowledge, but it symbolized the broader transformation that had occurred during 6 months of desperate fighting in the Solomon Islands. American forces had arrived on Guadalcanal in August 1942 with doctrine developed for different terrain against different enemies. They departed in December with proven tactics specifically designed for jungle combat against an adversary that employed infiltration and close-range attacks as primary methods. The Thompson submachine gun had been at the center of this transformation, evolving from a weapon that commanders feared to authorize during night operations into the cornerstone of aggressive small unit tactics that gave Marines decisive advantages at the ranges where Pacific combat was decided. The lessons learned on Guadalcanal regarding systematic weapons employment, fire discipline, and small unit organization would influence Marine Corps training and operations throughout the remainder of World War II and into subsequent conflicts. The specific weapon systems would change as technology advanced, but the fundamental principles remained constant. Superior equipment meant nothing without tactical procedures that enabled its safe and effective employment under the worst possible conditions. The jungle nights that had terrified Marines in September 1942 had become, by December, an environment where American small units operated with confidence that reflected training, experience, and tactical innovations born from necessity. The Thompson's distinctive sound signature, which had once made it too dangerous to use after dark, had become a symbol of American adaptation and the systematic problem-solving that would characterize the Marine Corps approach to tactical challenges throughout the modern era. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.